Flipping the Table.
Hi, this is Michael. I wanted to welcome you back to our special Imhoff Archives series. It's hosted by my very good friend and colleague, Dan Imhoff, who is also an activist and the author of numerous books, articles, and editorials focused on transformation of food and farming. In the 2000s, Dan co-hosted with famed apple farmer Tim Bates a radio program for Mendocino County Public Radio called The Garden Show. Dan did some of the very first in-depth interviews with early pioneers who had shaped how we think about food and farming today. Flipping the Table is proud to host this series taken from Dan's tapes of those interviews in order to reveal the decades of thought, innovation, experimentation, and dedication that seeded the good food movement. Please enjoy Dan's interview.
Imhoff Archives. It is my great pleasure to introduce our guest today. Temple Grandin is well known for her books and insights on animal behavior. She has a PhD in animal science and is a professor at Colorado State University. Throughout her career, Dr. Grandin has spearheaded reform of the quality of life and humaneness of death for farm animals. She lectures widely on both animal science and autism. We're here today to discuss her new book, Animals Make Us Human, which she co-authored with Katherine Johnson. Temple Grandin, welcome to the Farm and Garden Show.
It's good to be here.
Can you please start by giving our listeners a sense of where you are in the country? What's the weather like? And I think you're at home. Are you on a ranch?
At home. I'm in Fort Collins, Colorado. That's about 50 miles north of Denver.
Uh-huh. And is it a ranch?
No, I just live in the city, but I spend about 85-90% of my time traveling. I get to see lots of ranches, lots of feedlots, lots of different places.
And do you have any animals of your own?
I can't, not when I'm traveling 85-90% of the time.
Yep.
Career has been for the last 15 years.
Well, you've written a number of books about animal behavior. What made you decide to write this particular book, Animals Make Us Human?
Well, we got particularly intrigued about the core emotional systems, because if you want to understand behavior or why you might have a behavior problem, you need to figure out what is motivating that behavior. And emotions are what motivates behavior. And the thing that's really interesting is these emotional systems are in the older primitive part of the brain, and the neuroscience research that mapped these systems actually been done quite a long time ago, but it's kind of hidden away in the neuroscience literature. One of the problems we've got in science is that each discipline has got its own journals, its own meetings, and they don't communicate very well. And in these core emotional systems, you've got fear, which is the primal emotion. You've got rage. That's what enables an animal to fight off a predator. You've got separation anxiety and panic, that's separation anxiety. And then you have seeking. That motivates an animal to go out and do things. And then some of the other emotions, of course, are sex, nurturing, and mother-young behavior, and play.
Yeah, you call these the blue ribbon emotions, and they were, I'm not sure if Dr. Jaak Ponskep at Washington State University developed these or just reported on them.
Well, he did some of the research on them, and then some of the other research he reported on, but he came up with the concept that they're core emotional systems that all mammals have. People and animals both have these emotional systems. I can remember in the 60s when I took the general psychology class studying the cat that goes into a rage when the thalamus is stimulated. And then back then people called it sham rage for fake rage. It wasn't fake rage, it was real rage.
Yeah, and I found that this idea of the blue ribbon emotions or the core emotions that you framed the book around a really excellent way to just get people to begin to imagine why animal behavior is the way it is. What are animals reacting to?
emotions are the motivators of behavior, I had a very interesting question one time. Somebody asked me, what's the difference between an instinct and an emotion? They said, well, aren't animals all driven by instincts? Well, emotions are what motivate behavior, and you can have learned behavior. Now, what instincts are, and they're species-specific with different species, are hardwired behavior patterns that are turned on by emotions. Like, for example, when the dog wants to play, he puts his butt up in the air and his front of his body down on the ground does the play bow. Cats do not do that behavior. The play bow is a canine species typical hardwired instinctual behavior.
Yeah, and I think also then you try to use this emotional framework, these core emotions, almost as a check and balance system when you're examining some kind of behavior. For example, a chicken in a cage who's pecking may not be acting out of aggression or rage, but just really out of innate curiosity, and the only thing to peck is actually the chicken next to them.
Well, that's right, because what do chickens do out in nature? They spend a tremendous amount of time pecking. Now, another emotional system in the chicken that's important is to hide when they lay an egg. And the chicken wants to have a secluded place to lay her egg, because out in the wild, the chickens that laid their eggs out in the clearing, fox is going to eat up, that chicken. So, that's why they want the secluded place. And that is a hardwired behavior, but it's motivated by fear.
Right.
And just the way a chicken pecks is hardwired. But an animal's not just all instinct. Animals also are capable of learned behavior. As you know, with operant conditioning, studied in psychology class, the rat in a Skinner box, he learns if he presses a switch, he gets a food reward.
You're autistic. And you're well known, in fact, for being autistic and also just highly successful and have achieved a lot of your life. And you also grew up around animals. And what amazed me about your book was that you have amazing recall about the animals that you've met over the course of your life. You're just able to recall so many different stories about so many animals, even ones that you didn't grow up around. But how did your childhood shape your understanding of animals?
Well, of course, in the 50s, all the dogs just ran loose. And we didn't have all these behavior problems, all this biting, all this separation anxiety, chewed up paws, chewed up doors, and things like that. And the dogs were all socialized to other dogs and to children. Now, the bad thing was a lot of dogs were killed by cars. That was really, really bad. But their social life was a whole lot better. And today, dogs are leading a really controlled life. And in order to give a dog a good life, you're going to need to spend an hour a day with it, taking it out for walks, playing with it, giving it walks in the dog park so it gets a chance to play with other dogs. It's very important for puppies to get socialized to other dogs and get socialized to other people. And it's especially important to get them socialized to toddlers. They've got to learn that those little people are people too. Otherwise, when the dog grows up, you can get some dangerous behavior. Now, one of the things where autism has helped me in understanding animals is I think in pictures. I don't think in language. If you want to understand animal behavior, you've got to start thinking about what is it like to not have language. Thinking in pictures, thinking in smells, thinking in audio. It's sensory-based learning and thinking. It's not language-based. And I didn't know when I was a little kid that my thinking was different. I thought everybody thought in pictures like me. And it wasn't until I wrote Thinking in Pictures in the mid-'90s that I understood the full extent of how my thinking was different when I started questioning people about how they think.
Is reading difficult for you?
Well, when I read things, I convert it into a movie. Like, okay, if somebody asks me, name all the different vegetables you can name quickly, I see the produce stand in the store, and I just start going along the produce stand. I see them as I name them.
Yeah, because it seems you certainly have read a lot, and you've read a lot about animal behavior and agriculture and the food system in general, and it certainly seems to come up a lot with you as a writer and a thinker.
Well, my mind kind of was like Google for images. Somebody asks me a question, we'll think about, why don't you ask me, why don't you Google me, and I'll tell you how my mind works. Give me a word, something that's not here in an office.
Right, right. Back to the dogs for 1 second. This was a fascinating part of the book, and it seems to me that you're reporting, or you're getting out there that there's some very new thoughts about dog socialization. That dogs may not necessarily have this really contentious fight for who's the alpha dog, but that rather they're much more family-like.
Well, when you look at wolf packs, actually are families. But where the people got off the track on thinking that all dogs had these strict dominance hierarchies is because they studied dogs, wolves, and that were not related. And one of the things you get into all the discussions about, like Cesar Millan and things like that. There's some situations with, the aggressive kind of dogs, pushy kind of dog, going to growl at you and tell you to get off his chair. Then you might need to be doing some of the Cesar techniques. But those methods do not work with separation anxiety or with fear-based behaviors, because those are a totally different emotional system. I've seen some episodes of Cesar Millan where I thought he did a really good job with some of the aggressive dogs, and he did an absolutely terrible job with a dog that was afraid of the scissors, and it growled through the whole entire episode, and it did not get over its fear. It just stayed scared.
Mm-hmm. And what did you think was driving that?
That was fear. Mm-hmm. The emotion of the dog being afraid of the scissors, that's fear. If you have a dog that's chewing up the house while you're away and licking his paw until it's all raw, that's separation anxiety. See, fear and separation anxiety are separate emotions. Aggression is separate. They're actually separate systems. You can actually breed animals to be the high fear or low fear, or high separation anxiety or low separation anxiety. Those experiments were done with quail, actually, years ago.
Mm-hmm. And when you're analyzing a problem like that, do you feel that it's easy for you to get inside the emotional state of a given animal?
Well, fear is the emotion that I understand the best, because as a person with autism, when I got into puberty, I started having non-stop panic attacks. That was it was fear-based, and fear is one of the main emotions in autism. So I really understand behavior in animals that's fear-related, like a horse that's afraid of something, or a cow that's afraid of something, or even a dog that's afraid of something. That's the emotion I probably understand best.
Mm-hmm. And are you able to understand it and keep it under control? Is it something that you have to continually work at?
Well, I'm taking antidepressant medication, and I would not be here if I wasn't on antidepressant medication. As I got through my 20s, the panic attacks got worse and worse and worse and worse.
You seem to be able to, though, really channel your energies into a very positive outcome for other creatures.
Well, that's what I want to do. I want to make practical change. When I did my work with cattle, it was basically with visual thinking. I was one of the first people to notice the kind of things that frightened cattle when they were going through the chutes. If they saw a chain hanging down, they saw a reflection on shiny metal, they saw a person walking by with green gloves, something that moved rapidly, those were the kind of things that scared them. And if you remove those kind of things from the chutes, then they'd walk right through them. They also are afraid of the dark. And if you light it up, they'll walk in.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And can you talk a little bit about the work with cattle? How long did it take for you to come up with these new systems? What was the I was interested in the book that you said, in your childhood, you felt that cattle were raised very, very humanely, very responsibly for the most part in Arizona and on the ranches around where you lived, and that the real problems that you saw growing up were really in the transportation.
In my early 20s, actually, when I saw that. And the big problems were the handling and the transport, which were terrible. But the living conditions for the cattle actually were good. But then even with the handling and transport, there were a few people that actually handled cattle right. So maybe 20% of the places would handle cattle right. And so I could see that cattle could be really done really right. And there was a beautiful ranch out in Arizona called Singing Valley Ranch. They had the most gorgeous Hereford cattle, and Bill and Penny Porter were the nicest people. and they really influenced me on, to show me that, beef cattle really could be raised right.
And at this point, were you a graduate student?
I was getting my master's at Arizona State University at this point.
And how did livestock? How did you gravitate toward livestock as something?
I was originally in the field of psychology, and that was during the height of the B.F. Skinner era, where everything was operant conditioning, and there was just I didn't believe that, because as an undergraduate I took a really good ethology course, which is the study of animal behavior in the natural environments, and I just couldn't believe that everything was operant conditioning. In fact, one time I asked Dr. B.F. Skinner, I said, we need to learn about the brain. And he says, well, we don't need to learn about the brain because we have operant conditioning. Well, in my previous book, Animals in Translation, a friend of B.F. Skinner, saw him after he'd had a stroke, and he admitted that we needed to get inside the brain at that point.
Mm-hmm. And so then at some point, your psychology led you to ethology, animal behavior study.
Well, that's right. And then my aunt had a ranch. I was out there, when I was in high school, and sometimes, you start out, I thought I was going to be an experimental psychologist originally, but I get really turned off by that. I had 1 year towards a master's, and it was in the height of the B.F. Skinner era, and they were doing a lot of cruel experiments to animals, shocking them constantly and things like that. I couldn't see any point in it either. It was cruel, and what did you learn from it? It was sort of like just to make journal articles. I want to study animal behavior to really learn what's going on and figure out how to make life better for animals.
Yeah. And you ultimately ended with a PhD in animal science?
That's correct. I have a PhD in animal science from the University of Illinois.
I think right now you're at Colorado State University.
That's correct.
You have a colleague there, Bernard Rollins.
Yes.
Bernard has written quite extensively that he really wishes that we could go back from an era of animal science to the old era of animal husbandry.
To have good animal husbandry, you don't necessarily have to go back and be old-fashioned. What you do is you need to have husbandry. Another term for husbandry is stockmanship. People, really taking care of animals. And there's been quite a bit of research on stockmanship. There's a scientist down in Australia named Paul Hemsworth, and we write about him in Animals Make Us Human. He found that if pigs are afraid of people, they have less piglets. Dairy cows that are afraid of people, or they've been treated badly and whacked and screamed at, are going to give less milk. I mean, good stockmanship pays. And too often times people think that they can just do everything with the new milking parlor, the new drug, the new whatever. And then, good equipment makes, good treatment of animals easier, but you've got to have stockmanship to go along with it. And good stockmanship is paying attention to detail, making sure the bedding stays dry and you replace the bedding, making sure they got clean feed, making sure they're not, afraid of people. It's just a whole lot of little details. And too often people want the magic fix, and they're not willing to just do the good stockmanship. And I think it's a shame that, we're losing that. And I'm very, very concerned that we're getting fewer and fewer young people today going into field work types of things. And I have a student that's, just finishing up her PhD, and she started out with no background in livestock at all, and she got to working with cattle and pigs, and she found she really liked working with them. But, if students don't have a chance to, work on field kinds of things, they're not going to find out that they like it.
Right. Well, I can see that so much of your book is just filled with observation, and it ends with this real call to about field work, about this desperate need for students to not just stay in academia and stay inside the lab and in the world of statistics, but to actually be out there and learning through field observation.
Well, what we need to do is we need to combine the modern science with the field work. And some of the really good examples, look at all the work that's done now with genetic, breaking the genetic code and all the genome sequencing and things like that, is that you can take, work on the genome, and you can use that, with samples you get from field work. There's ways to combine both the field work things and the science. the thing that people need to be doing is working on bridging that divide. In fact, the National Institute of Health has realized that they finally need to do this, because you've got scientists over on one side doing all the basic research, and you've got doctors working with patients, and they're not communicating, and they've got their own journals and their own meetings, and they don't communicate. And there's already starting to be some interest in what's called translational research to get across that divide between the basic science and the field work. Now, of course, in medicine, the field work is the doctors that are working with the patients.
Right. And if we get into the if we just step back from what you were saying before about this lack of observation, or people really looking for some kind of technological fix in their farming operations that aren't necessarily also involved with a change in management. One thing that you talk about in animal production is that the industry seems to go for these ever expensive technological solutions, but in order to pay for them, they have to have more and more and more animals in one place, and they almost inevitably involve less labor, and they create more difficult conditions for the animals when perhaps just a change in behavior or management might.
Well, and then you get another thing that's a problem. This is one of my big concerns, is overloading the biological system. Okay, you breed the dairy cow to make more and more and more milk, and then she starts to have more and more problems, like she'll only last for 2 years of milking instead of 4 years of milking, lameness problems, metabolic problems. You just overload the biological system of the cow until she's falling apart. And I have real serious concerns about that. Or you grow chickens too fast and they have weak bones, or you grow pigs too fast, they have weak bones, or you give pigs too many, drugs to, enhance their growth, and that causes weakness problems and lameness problems, just pushing that biology. And this is something that I have real concerns with. Now, when it comes just to size of operation, whether it's a large dairy or a small dairy, I've seen good big, and I've seen bad big, and I've seen bad small, and I've seen good small. But it's just pushing too much, where you're just going for, all we're going to do is just get milk production out of her. It isn't even cost effective what they're doing, because if you have to replace the cow after 2 years of milking, that's pretty expensive. It took you 2 years to grow the cow up to become a dairy cow.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's almost like you're reading my mind, because I wanted to go into this subject. It's a big part of animals make us human. This thought of this genetic stress that we have on animals, and we're basic. I think that at one point you say that when animals are bred for a single trait, that nature will usually give you a nasty surprise.
That's absolutely right. I mean, let's look at dogs. We've got some of these problems. Breeding a bulldog with a nose that's more and more smashed in and you can't breathe. They got to have their babies by cesarean. Look at all the hip problems in dogs. And, you're breeding just more and more extreme for appearance traits. Doesn't matter whether it's a production trait or an appearance trait. You over-select for a single trait, you're going to end up wrecking your animal. And some of the dogs, I mean, I have a student who's got a Shar-Pei, and this dog is... he's got all kinds of problems with his skin. I mean, he was a rescue dog. He's a very nice dog, a rescue, but he's so wrinkly that he has all these skin problems.
Well, if you were offered, if the Secretary of Agriculture called you up and said, Temple, we would like to give you a special project, a 21st century genetics project for domesticated livestock. Do you have any idea how you would start? Who would you go to assemble a team of of your best players?
A lot of different people. One of the things I want to look at is you have to have the dairy cow that milks the absolute the most is oftentimes she's not handled extremely well. It's going to have welfare problems, but it's also probably not even efficient, because the cow doesn't last very long.
Right.
You want to have systems where, see, the problem with human beings is they tend to just get one theory in their mind, and they just get single-minded on one thing. And you need to look at the whole system. How is it environmentally? How is it from animal welfare? From a labor standpoint, just the whole entire thing. what are sensible, sustainable systems. Not getting back to beef cattle on grass, that's definitely sustainable, and they can graze on land that, goats and sheep and cattle can graze on land that's not suitable for crops. In fact, one of my concerns right now with all the biofuels is there's a lot of pasture land, good pasture land down in South America right now getting turned into crops, and pasture land turning into land for growing grain for biofuels and things like that. That's not good for soil erosion. You have to look at, a lot of people have a real difficult time looking at a whole system. How does the whole system work? They have a tendency just to look at one little part of it.
Yeah, so back to the genetics and improving the genetics, let's say, of the dairy cow, or you can take your pick, the white Cornish cross broiler chicken. So it would be an animal that would live a lot longer, maybe not produce quite as much.
You cut back the milk production just a little bit, and then she's going to live for 4 or 5 years of milking instead of just 2 years of milking, and it's going to be a lot better for the cow, and I think it's going to be a lot better for everything. But it's what is a sustainable system. Another big concern of mine is sort of the monoculture thing. Mm-hmm. You get a monoculture and you get a disease in that, it can just go through the whole thing, and there's a need to breed for disease resistance. But if you breed for disease resistance, you're probably going to have less production. And I don't think biotechnology is going to change that, because it takes energy to operate an immune system to fight off disease, either in a plant or an animal. And it takes energy to make it grow. And real high-producing animals, they got to eat more feed. Plants have got to eat more fertilizer. There's a little thing called physics that you just can't override. It takes energy to do things. And maybe, let's say you bred a plant or an animal that was super hardy and super productive, you're probably going to need a feed IV to get enough feed into it, or a fertilizer IV to get enough food into it.
Well, and it's true. It seems that with the Holstein in particular, it's an animal that requires a lot of inputs. Yes, it's certainly productive, but it requires a lot of veterinary care.
Holstein right now has gotten to where she's very difficult to breed back. And I think what possibly could be happening is nature has a mechanism that when an animal gets too skinny, reproduction in the female animal is shut down. And maybe that mechanism is getting triggered in the Holstein because they're very, very hard to breed. Some dairymen now are crossing them with other breeds, but the problem with American Holstein is that the biology's just been pushed to the point where the cow's falling apart. I think we're going to have to give a little bit on the milk production. I would not go back to 1950s cows or anything like that, but you just give a little bit to put some hardiness back in.
Hey, I hope you're enjoying Dan's interview with another pioneer of the good food movement. I wanted to take a break and ask for your support, because with your generous contribution, we can provide more interesting content that cultivates support for better food and more resilient farms and ranches. So please go to our website, rootsofchange.org. That's rootsofchange.org, and hit the donate button. Any amount helps us to make the world a better place. Thank you. And now back to Dan's interview.
And as you go around and travel, do you feel that the dairy industry is looking ahead toward that? Or
people are amazingly blind. I can remember when the pig industry brought the lean line pigs in the 80s, in the late 80s, and then the 90s. And I started observing problems with excitable pigs that were very difficult to handle. And people thought that was kind of crazy. But then, and it turned out I was right about that. There's actually been research that was done that showed that some of these lean line pigs were meaner and fought more than some of the the fatter kinds of pigs. But then they started getting into horrible lameness problems. They were just selecting for growth, large loins, and thin back fat, and they forgot about looking at feet and leg conformation and feet and leg soundness. And it got so bad about 8 or 9 years ago that half the market pigs were lame, and it was due to bad conformation. got into single trait selection and forgot about feet and legs. Now the industry's realizing that they got to do something about feet and legs. But I just stood there and watched that happen. And you tell people about it, you write articles about it, and it's like they're blind to it. It's like they don't see it. It's like the people that I work with. I've trained people how to find all the little distractions that scare cattle, like the chain hanging down, the reflection on the shiny metal. They're afraid of us seeing a piece of plastic flapping up ahead, and I show people how to find these things and take them out. But I still have to show a slide that shows a chain hanging down in a chute. It's a slide I've been showing for 35 years because people don't take it out. It's like they don't see it.
Wow.
And this is they don't tend to see these problems like lameness in chickens. They didn't see it until it got really bad, and then now, fortunately, they're starting to really breed some feet and some legs back.
What is the timeline on kind of long-term genetic improvement? That must take a decade at least to come up with some reasonable achievements.
Well, of course, animals that breed quickly, you can change it quickly, but I think we're getting up to the limits on productivity on like dairy cows and chickens, and there's going to be a point. There's a point where you push that biology where the animal falls apart, and the dairy cow, the American Holstein, I want to specify it's the American Holstein, I think, gotten to that point. She's just falling apart.
Well, another common theme, in addition to this genetic overloading that you've just talked about so well in our animal agriculture, is the importance of just changing management, and that in turn can change behavior of workers. And you sometimes argue that it's easy to make some kind of technological change and make some sort of infrastructure improvement in a factory farm or any animal production facility, but it's much harder to change the behavior of workers.
Well, one of the things that Paul Hemsworth worked on, changing the attitude of workers. What I have found, if you have a problem with workers, there's usually a problem with management. When I first started out my career working with cattle, I'd go out and I'd train workers. When I finally got to where I stopped training workers, there was only one person I wanted to train, was the manager. Because if I didn't train the manager and get the manager convinced that good cattle handling was important, he'd untrain the workers as soon as I left. You've got to get management, to buy into it. And another thing with workers, you can't understaff. You understaff and overwork the workers, there's no way they can do a good job. They're going to be just too tired. And that people have learned that with pigs and chickens. Like if you're loading pigs and chickens up onto trucks, after the workers have worked for 6 or 7 hours, they just get so tired, the death losses in the animals go up because the workers are just too tired. Also, another thing I've observed on people that handle animals, putting workers on incentive pay to reduce bruises, to reduce broken wings, that really helps. Another thing is, there's some people that are just like to be mean to animals, and they just should not be there.
Right.
They just should. I know it's a harsh thing to say. When I was working with McDonald's and Wendy's and Burger King on auditing the meat plants, and we started scoring the plants on electric prod use, and they had to get their electric prod use way, way down from, doing it like 5 times on every animal, down to 75% of the animals not having electric prod at all. There were certain people that just wouldn't put the prod away. And if you had 10 workers in a big plant, putting beef cattle up the chutes, there'd be one that they'd have to fire. They'd have to get rid of him. And he just can't be working with cattle.
Right. I thought that was very interesting in the book, very useful. The new book, Animals Make Us Human. You have a lot of checklists on, what kinds of, how could you grade improvement, right? And if it was in the case of loading chickens, you could see, they would have to have only a certain percentage that were injured from being, moved around.
Well, the problem is if you don't measure it. Well, this is another thing that drove me crazy. Is I go someplace, I build a really nice system, get the workers all trained. Then I come back a year later, and it was terrible. And what had happened is they slowly slid into rough practices. So you've got to measure handling. You've got to count. Well, how many animals fell down during handling? How many animals did they hit during handling? How many animals ran into a fence or gate? And these are things that I can count. And then you can tell, am I getting better or am I getting worse? And so one of the big things I've been working on right now is getting people to measure handling. And now the latest thing that's going on to try to keep meat plants good is measuring handling over video cameras, over a web link to a commercial auditing firm. And then the auditors look in at any time to make sure they're not using the electric prod.
That was my next question, is whether you thought if the walls of the hog farms and chicken poultry plants and dairies and the slaughtering houses were glass, if there was somehow some kind of transparency, would that motivate a change in behavior?
Oh yes, these plants that have the video camera system in, they behave themselves. Big Brother's watching, and it does make a difference. Because one of the problems with having just people go in and audit it is they can behave good while you're there. Now, one thing that's drastically changed is the maintenance of equipment. That they can't fix just when you're there. So that's drastically improved. Like stunning of cattle, for example, is very, very dependent on the maintenance of that stunning equipment. And that's something they can't do while you're out in the lobby while you're getting your coat and hat on. They can go up, radio out to the yards and say, put the electric prods away. But they can't fix the stunners while you're putting the hat and coat on and giving you coffee. So that part of it's gotten a whole lot better. Basically, agriculture needs to show what it does. And I've taken quite a lot of people through a large, big slaughterhouse, and when they see the cattle just walking up the ramp, they kind of go, well, that's not as bad as I thought it was going to be. It passes the test. If you have chickens crammed in cages so tight that they're on top of each other, no, that does not pass the test. I think I've many times have said to people in agriculture, we need to look at everything what we do. We need to look at all the things that we do and go, if I brought 10 people out from the airport, or I brought my wedding guests out there, what would they think? Could I explain what I'm doing, or am I going to be squirming?
Excellent idea. Now, you've spent a lot of time, you did a fair amount of research on pigs, and I found it very interesting. It's in some ways it's pretty sadistic the way pigs are born today, in that their mothers are confined in these crates and they can't move around, and they become lame and extremely bored, and they have a very unnatural environment.
Well, the lameness problem, a lot of that.
And then then they move them into these other crates where the mothers are still confined, and the babies can nurse, but they can't get crushed by the mother.
The biggest problem is the gestation stalls, where the pregnant sow is spending her pregnancy before she has babies, stall where she can't turn around. That's something that the industry needs to just flat get rid of. That I did a little survey on the airlines, and I basically found that 2/3 of the public absolutely hates gestation stalls.
Yeah.
That's just a type of confinement that just goes too far. I remember talking to one guy, he had hunting dogs, and he says, well, I wouldn't put my dogs in that. My dogs should be able to turn around. And I think that now to say that we've got to go back to get rid of all large farms and go back all the small farms, that's not going to be practical. I mean, what I think is going to happen is there's going to be a lot of the niche markets, grass-fed beef and natural and organic, and I think that's all really good. But there's still going to need to be a low-cost, large-scale commercial, and it needs to have a lot of improvements. And gestation stalls, that's something that they need to get rid of that.
Right. You were also saying that there's a lot of things that can be done that accounts for the social needs of the pigs, and it's very important to not put too few animals in an area too quickly, and not move them around so that they're not with individuals that they don't know too quickly.
If you have to mix pigs, you're better off mixing gigantic groups. You can go into a meat plant and they got 200 pigs in a pen from maybe 5 or 6 different pens, and there's hardly any fights. And the reason why those big groups often work is because if someone's being attacked, they have plenty of room to get away. Where if you just have 5 pigs in a little pen, it's like scorpions in a bottle. And if you run, let's say you're doing sows, the mother pigs, when they're just gestating, you have 5 pigs in the pen, that's got to be in what's called a static group. In other words, you don't mix them. If you're going to be mixing them, you need to have big groups, and that's what most people have learned that.
Mm-hmm. There are 2 types of chickens that we raise in huge quantities. The biggest are the broiler chickens, and then also our egg layers. And you write that you think that the hen, the laying hen, probably suffers the most of all of our domesticated animals
Laying
right now.
hens have got the most problems. Broilers, the broiler, which is your meat chicken, like you have for fried chicken, they've never been in cages. Broilers are just in great big sheds, running around on the floor on sawdust. And one of my big concerns right now about cellulosic ethanol is all your bedding materials like straw and sawdust. If we all go to cellulosic ethanol, those bedding materials all going to end up in the ethanol plants.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, the ethanol pretty much is just the grain-based, but I've been reading about developing a cellulosic, and it's going to make it bedding material just sky-high expensive if it all starts going into ethanol. But the broilers have always lived in just a big shed, shavings on the floor. They've never been in cages. The biggest problem you have in those sheds is they don't the ammonia levels. You've got to really ventilate those sheds. But the chickens, the layers, I can remember going out and visiting some layers where they were jammed in so tight that the birds, when they slept at night, they were on top of each other. And I said to the manager, this was just hideous. And, how would a bunch of people from the airport, think of this? The next day he called me up and he kind of goes, oh, I never thought about that. They got so used to looking at these half-bald things, they thought it was normal. And a lot of the feather loss has a genetic component.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, they are just crammed into cages.
Way.
But it's not, and then after they, just become egg production machines their whole life and really don't live a very chicken life like existence, they're pretty much just abandoned.
Well, this is the thing that's really bad. When I found out, you see, I was in cattle for the first 10 years of my career, and I talked in the end part of my book and the afterward, that maybe if egg layers had been what I'd been exposed to in my 20s when I was, in my first going into livestock, my career might have taken a different direction, but instead it was exposed to cattle. I was cattle the first 10 years, cattle and pigs in the 80s, and I didn't get involved with chickens at all until the 90s, and I have to say I was pretty disgusted when I found out that the laying hen, when she gets old, there's not enough laying hen to make it worth processing her for soup, so they throw her in the dump, and that some people were putting chickens in giant dumpsters alive, and that's absolutely horrible.
So how do you go into an industry that's just as fast-paced?
Economics. Like when I worked with McDonald's and Wendy's and Burger King on the McDonald's audit starting back in 1999, I saw more change than I'd seen in 20 years of a career prior to that. When large buyers, that are like $1 million worth of business, just a one big plant, tell them they got to clean it up. Money talks. Economics. They get the big buyers insisting on change, then things will change.
What industry of all of the cattle and the pork and poultry industries that you've worked with, which do you feel has made the most changes over your career?
Well, when it comes to handling and at the slaughterhouses, the most changes have been in beef and pork. They've made the most improvements. Now, beef has always been outside, and they don't have the housing issues that pork and chicken would have. But the pork and beef are ahead of the chicken industry when it comes to coming out with good welfare standards. The pork has got now they have an auditing program where they're actually doing some auditing of things like body condition score, trucker quality assurance programs. The beef people are coming out with a trucker training program. This stuff is way ahead of the poultry people.
Mm-hmm.
But then the egg layer people, when it comes to doing some scientific stuff, welfare actually have done more than the broiler people have done.
I did really enjoy the book throughout, and you talk about horses and cats and dogs, and animal emotions and behavior. And you also wrote that you're worried that we won't always have a Jane Goodall.
No, I'm worried about that because, you have a lot of young people today that are interested in animal issues. I mean, they have a tendency to want to become a lawyer. Well, it's fine to become a lawyer, but you need to understand what's actually happening with the issues on the ground. Otherwise, you can do lawsuits or you can make policy that are not going to work on the ground. I'm getting concerned today about policymakers on any issue, not just animal issues, anything, getting too far removed from the actual real issue. And I call that abstractification. I talked about that in Animals in Translation, and I talked about that in Animals Make Us Human.
Also, the work that's the animals that are so threatened right now, I think what you're insisting on is that they're not going to be saved by people really far away coming up with innovative programs, that there's so much that people are learning about animals on the ground and even breeding in captivity that requires really insightful observation.
Well, that's absolutely right. And then another problem you have in some of the developing countries is to make people want to save the animals or wildlife. The wildlife has to do something for the people. If elephants just are these terrible things that eat up your garden and eat up your family's food, you're not going to feel very good about elephants. If you can elephants that bring tourist money in and things like that, then the locals are going to want to save the elephants.
Mm-hmm. I think also you had an affinity to Jane Goodall because she didn't necessarily go in the front door to do the work that she does today.
She went in the back door, and I'm another person who went in the back door. And, we need to, look for the back doors. There's a lot of creative people around. I mean, I do a lot of talks in the autism community. I have a lot of people that are Asperger's, which is kind of the mild form of autism. And, I was lucky to have a great science teacher mentor when I was in high school who got me interested in science. There's a lot of smart kids out there kind of floundering around, just not knowing what to do. And if they get introduced to something interesting, like wildlife study, and they go, oh, boy, now I'm going to knuckle down and study in school so I can be a wildlife biologist. But if you don't expose these kids to interesting things, then they're going to just get addicted to video games, and that's not going to lead to a satisfying career.
And when you go into a zoo, and as somebody who understands very well animal behavior, animal emotions, and then this almost contradictory notion that we can make some semi-natural environment out of confinement. Do you ever walk into a zoo and feel like it's a good place for animals that are typically in the wild?
Well, for some animals, it depends upon the zoo. I've seen some very nice chimpanzee exhibits where they had, complete families in there, and they had a very good life. I've seen some awful tiger exhibits and things like that where the cats were just pacing around, and it was just terrible. A lot of the smaller animals are easier to keep. I've seen some beautiful bird exhibits that are like a jungle, and the birds can fly around in this great big aviary. Zoos are getting, a whole lot better about making a good environment. And there's some animals that some zoos are phasing out, like elephants, because they're really hard to keep in a small place in a decent environment.
Mm-hmm. And probably the future of some animals may actually rest upon our ability to breed at least some inherent part of the remaining diversity in captivity.
Well, the other thing is, I've found a lot of kids kind of need to see the real thing to get them interested.
Uh-huh.
You take little kids to the zoo that gets them interested. And zoos are getting a lot better. I've done a lot of work with zoos on training animals to tolerate their, to cooperate with their vaccinations. So that the animal just comes in and just stands injections and he gets his vaccinations and things like that.
Right, is a willing patient. I have this feeling that you're one of those people who, the older you get, the more amazed you are by what you haven't learned yet. And there's a lot of excitement in your book.
You always keep learning. I'm always learning. Every day I learn something.
I loved what you wrote about, just these very, very strange emergences that that dolphins can blow smoke rings, that this kind of sadistic story about the rapist roosters when genetic engineering went bad. And
actually, that wasn't genetic engineering. It was plain old-fashioned
I misspoke.
breeding.
You're right.
Okay.
Yeah. That what they were trying to do was to change a problem, they thought, by selecting for a certain trait, and they ended up making pretty aggressive birds, no?
Yeah, they ended up with really aggressive birds, and then now, fortunately, I think that's starting to get corrected.
And then there was also this idea that chimpanzees have these amazing memories, amazing botanical memories.
Yeah, no, and that is sensory-based thinking.
Right. I mean, so when you're out and about these days in your career, where are you traveling to most that you're learning? Are you still working in a lot of production facilities?
Yep.
Are you gravitating towards new places that you hadn't been before?
Well, I'm still doing a lot of things with, doing things with the, with the meat packing plants, the slaughter plants. But I try to get out, do a lot of different things, read a lot of different stuff, always keep learning new things.
Mm-hmm. How do you see your life and your work in the next 10 years? Are there big things that you'd like to accomplish?
Well, I'd like to, communicate with students and get them turned on and interested in doing things like field work, getting students interested in science. I'm very concerned about these smart Asperger kids, the kind of geeky kids that are not getting into good careers because they don't get into something that really turns them on. I do a lot of talks on that in the autism and the Asperger community. We've got to get these kids exposed to interesting things.
And if you had your own government department, would you see yourself more in education? Would you see yourself in agriculture? Are you must really like to be able to cross the disciplines.
I like
mix
being
it all up.
I like being able to cross disciplines.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I like being able to do.
Right. You had a co-author for this book, Katherine Johnson. And
Yes.
you've done work with her before.
Yes, I worked with her on Animals in Translation.
How does that process go?
Well, when we did Animals in Translation, we did hours and hours and hours and hours of interviews. I mean, it was like, 3-hour conversations, 1-hour conversations, hashing everything out, discussing it. She would write it up, and then I'd get it back, and because I need, she helps me with the structure. One thing I want to give Katherine Johnson credit for was linking the core emotions, the blue ribbon emotions, as the motivators to abnormal stereotypies, like the dog licking his paw and the pacing in the polar bear. But in the farming chapters, what she did was, kind of write up the rough draft, and then it's sort of like I have to always use a visual thinking. In the farm animal chapters, she did the Christmas tree, and then I had tons and tons and tons of ornaments.
And as you work, do you write, or do you then have a conversation that she puts into words?
And what we did on Animals Make Us Human, then I added lots of writing to it, and then sent it back to her. But she would, when we did Animals in Translation, we did hours, hundreds of hours of interviews.
Right. If you were to refer to people to some of your favorite books about animal behavior and things that you've found really, really interesting to your work and essential to your work, could you do that?
Oh, I'm going to have a hard time. I'm sorry, I just can't get them off the tip of my tongue right now.
That's
sorry.
okay. No, that's often a difficult question. Like, what are you reading lately? You're reading 6 books and you can't remember one.
Well, that's the problem, and I have to my mind works like Google on kind of a slow computer. I have to start going through different subjects in animals.
Right. Well, it's been a great conversation, Temple Grandin. I can't recommend your book enough. Animals Make Us Human. Are you working on another book right now?
I'm thinking about it right now, but thank you so much for having me on the show.
Well, I appreciate it, and have a great year.
I will. Thank you so much.
Hey, this is Michael. As you know, Flipping the Table is sponsored by Roots of Change. You can keep our program going by making a contribution to Roots of Change through our website, rootsofchange.org.